thank you all of you for coming tonight. This is the last of our summer season of lectures. And tonight I'm very happy that we've got Laura Mazow here from the University of North Carolina. East Carolina University, to talk about reclaiming the road not taken, Indigenous knowledge versus classical perceptions at Beth Zur. And this is the kind of subject which is quite close to the heart of the PEF, I think, because it's using archival material from, excavations which have already taken place. It's very eco-friendly archaeology in that sense, reuse, recycle, and so on. And looking again at those results, looking again at them anew with a slightly different eye, an eye that perhaps is a little bit more aware of the complexities of how knowledge is acquired and the pitfalls and the kind of problems, the assumptions of the excavators and so on, and trying to pick out from that perhaps the voices that haven't been heard when people have been coming up with their hypotheses as to what all this archaeology actually means. And it's a really important kind of project to do, because unless you do that, you're always going to have the skew. You're always going to have an unrealized bias in your work. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Laura to talk on this subject. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm really excited to be here. I mean, for me, the Palestine Exploration Fund was, it's just been a part of my research and a part of, it's been the journals and the annuals. And so to actually be present in the building, I sort of walked around a little bit. I'm very excited. But let me get on with the talk. So Felicity did a great job of sort of explaining what I'm going to do here, right? So I was really lucky in that these older excavations, this is 1930s and 1950s, when they published their material, they actually laid out their thinking. So we can follow their thinking, which is really different than the way archaeological reports are written today, right? Which try to be very objective. They think they're being very scientific by just laying out the facts as they perceive them, and they don't tell us necessarily how they came to understand those facts. So I was really excited by this project, but I'm going to walk you through some of the different steps, and our focus is going to be on what's the function of a bathtub, which you probably never thought was a question, right? A bathtub's a bathtub, right? But we're going to look and think and see that maybe these aren't really bathtubs. I mean, when you think about it, the Middle East, hot, dry, not a ton of water. Were people really like bathing every day? They had personal bathtubs? Maybe not. Maybe bathing is sort of a much more modern invention, right? That people would bathe in a personal bathtub. So we're going to sort of look at that. We're going to think about it and see if it takes us in different places than we have been previously. But first I wanted to give you some idea of sort of how I got here, right? Because I'm actually a Bronze and Iron Age archaeologist, and we're going to be looking at a Hellenistic site. And except for a short foray during my wayward youth, I've really focused on Bronze and Iron Age archaeology. In fact, my dissertation was on a Philistine site. Yeah, well, I had to have some images of Philistines. I wasn't sure how much my audience knew about who the Philistines were, so I threw in some pictures. So this was a site that was, it's an Iron Age site, the directors were Cy Gittin and Trudy Dotan. Trudy Dotan of the Hebrew University, Cy Gittin of the Albright Institute, and they offered me to work on some of the material from the site, which I gladly took them up on. And particularly I was working at this one field 4, and I was doing a ceramic dissertation where I looked at, changes in ceramics over time. But I was also really interested in the context of each of these different rooms and buildings. And particularly there was this one building that had a bathtub in it. So here's the building, this is the bathtub, and I'm sorry I can't show you the real bathtub, but it's a terrible story. The archaeological notes say, see the video, right? The video, I had to search the archives for the video. They tried to lift the bathtub, right, and it slipped off the thing, crashed into a zillion pieces. There were like no pictures of this thing. So you're just gonna have to go with the drawing. So this is a bathtub from this site. And I couldn't really follow it up that much in my dissertation, but it was something I wanted to pursue afterwards. So bathtubs in the Levant aren't sort of indigenous to the Levant. They come in at a number of different times from different places. There are some standardized shapes. There's one that's sort of a more Aegean style that all of a sudden shows up in the Levant at around 1200. And then there's a break in time. And then there's a slightly different one that comes in the 8th, 7th century. That's a more sort of Assyrian style, comes in from Assyria, all of a sudden shows up. And there's a later Hellenistic one, which I didn't really deal with because I was a Bronze and Iron Age archaeologist, but it will become important later. This is one from Mycenae, actually, just to give you an example. And we'll be talking more about these Hellenistic bathtubs a little bit later. So traditionally, bathtubs have been thought of as for burial, and here's one that I took a photograph of. You can actually sort of see me in the reflection at the British Museum the other day. And it says in the description that it is a bath-shaped coffin. Sometimes these things do have bodies in them. They are used for burial, both in the Aegean world and in Mesopotamia. When they're not found in burial, though, when they're found like in a house or a building, then obviously that's not a coffin. What is that? So people have suggested ritual, because whenever you don't know what something is, it must be ritual. And they suggest like libations or ablutions, but nobody really talks about like what that activity really was. Like, did people like dip out of it and pour onto something? Or they just sort of throw out this term libation or ablution and don't really discuss like how it would have been used in this space. Or the association is personal bathing, right? That people would be taking a bath in these things. And I said, what's particularly interesting in the Southern Levant, in the area, Syria, Palestine, where I've been working, is they're not a local form. They come in from elsewhere. You can clearly see the influence. And so they're always assumed to have been associated with either the immigration of foreigners. Foreigners are showing up and creating this new thing, bringing this new idea with them, or it's elites emulating foreign customs, right? Taking on foreign ideas. So back to this room. Here's a picture of the room. The tub is already gone, so I threw in the word tub, but it would have been right there. And when I started looking at the complex of this room, what else was found in this room or in this building, I noticed that you have this one room here, and there's all these little features in it. There's all these little bins, right? So it's not a room you could walk in or sleep in. Something else is going on in it. I also noticed that in the room next door, we had one of the largest concentration of loom weights. So in case you don't know what a loom weight is, the typical loom at the time was a warp-weighted loom. And most of the loom is made out of wood and wooden preserve, but these weights at the bottom are often made out of clay or stone, and they preserve, right? So we often get these clusters of loom weights, and when you find a whole cluster of them, usually it means that there was a loom somewhere in the vicinity. So that was really interesting. One of our largest clusters was right here in the room next door to the bathtub. This also had the largest concentration of plying bowls. And plying bowls are, if you want to, after you spin the yarn, but sometimes you want to make a thicker yarn, you want to ply two yarns together to make a thicker yarn. So you would use a plying bowl to do that. There was also a large concentration of stone circles, like reused stone sherds. And Petrie suggested a long time ago that these sherds may have been used as bobbins. Like, after the vessel broke, you could then sort of make this circular thing, and you could use it to tie on the yarn and keep it under control, right? So you don't have lots of loose yarn all over the place. And I thought, I'm gonna go back to this. Oh, I don't know how to go back with this one. Now I'm going back too far. Really interesting that there was all this textile equipment in this room. So I started to think, what could a bathtub be in association with the textile technologies? Like, what would a bathtub serve? And when I started to look at other parallels in Cyprus, I also ran across this conjuncture of textile equipment with bathtubs. At the site of Ma Paleocastro in Cyprus, there was actually so much textile equipment with a whole bunch of bathtubs that Kariorgis suggested that the textile workers took a bath at the end of the day before they went home. There are also a lot of bathtubs that are found in secondary use in industrial areas. And I thought, well, that's a weird coincidence. Maybe these aren't secondary use, maybe these are primary use, right? How many times, there's just an assumption that there's a primary use someplace else, but maybe that's a wrong assumption. Maybe these really are in some sort of industrial use. And one of the things that I came across in the archaeological record, this is obviously much later, right? I'm still working Bronze and Iron Age, and here I am in the Roman period and reconstructions of Ostia and Pompeii. But these are known fulleries. These are known places where people fulled wool. Fulling wool is after you've woven the wool, you can do this added value process and make a thicker product. It's like a boiled wool sweater, right? It interlocks, it interweaves, it mats those fibers together to give you a much stronger, much tougher, a wind-resistant product. So you don't have to full, but you can, and you can end up with a better product. And I kind of was like, God, these guys are standing in bathtubs. That's really interesting. And it turns out that this term fulling appears really, really early in the textual record. We have it in Linear B texts, we have it in Ore 3 texts, so we know really early on that people were fulling. And it never occurred to anybody to look for what the archaeological signature of that would be. And so I thought, well, maybe that's what this is. We know, I said textual record is telling us that people are doing it, so maybe this is what it looked like. Maybe these are fulling installations. And I had it. Fulling interlocks or mats these woven textile fibers together. Wool also needs to be cleaned, it needs to be washed. And the same chemistry and physics that allows that fulling, that interlocking, that matting to happen is also something that when you're washing the wool, you don't want it to happen. So wool mats really easy. Think of that matted hair in your drain, right? That is a combination of hair, hot water, and some kind of detergent. So if you're cleaning your wool, right, and you're using some sort of detergent, you want to make sure you don't use any agitation or it's going to felt and you won't be able to spin it. So you want to carefully let it drip dry. So these are basins, bathtubs, I don't know what to call them in Turkey, modern Turkey, where somebody is washing and scouring the wool. But they're being very careful with it so that it doesn't mat. So I had all these pieces of information, but I still don't have a smoking gun, so I tried to do residue analysis, right? We've got ceramic tubs. I thought I'll go and I'll collect some samples and do some residue analysis, and you can see me and my colleague here. We went to Cyprus, we went to Israel, collecting all these samples, and we found soap, which still didn't get me over whether it was a bathtub or a textile soap. The type of soap we found is called date palm kernel oil, which is kind of like olive oil, right? It makes a really good textile soap. I've never heard people actually use date palm kernel oil soap for bathing, but you could. So I still didn't have my smoking gun. I still didn't like, this is not a bathtub, this is for textile processing. So then I came across this site, Beth Zur, and even though it wasn't Bronze and Iron Age, I was really excited because they found 15 bathtubs, and I thought, this is where I'm going to be able to solve my problem here, my conundrum, right? Figure it out. So this site was excavated in both 1931 and 1957, and it was a joint excavation between the McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago and the American Schools of Oriental Research in Jerusalem. And they saw themselves as sort of one of these first joint projects where the American school, now the Albright, was going to be able to serve as like this repository where you could borrow equipment, and there would be expertise that you could use, and you could store things there, and you could study things there. And so they really thought of themselves as this new way of excavating a site. And I said in the first season, they found 13 bathtubs. In the second season, they found another 2. The site is, the directors of the site in 1931 were Ovid Sellers and William Foxwell Albright. And immediately they were like, we've got all these installations. They're really, really interesting. We don't know what they are. They look like modern bathtubs. And it naturally attracted all this attention by the archaeologists who wanted to figure out what this stuff was. And the bathtubs, some of them were all clustered together in rooms, and some of them were individually in different places around the site. So again, I was really excited to see different contexts. So here's the excavation team. We've got, again, Sellers and Albright, who were very excited because they had a donor who was giving them some money, the president of McCormick Theological Seminary. So he thanks them, and they see themselves as adding to this, new corpus of information about history. They were interested in this site because it was associated with the Maccabean Wars, right? So that's what they were going for. You have Sellers here in the middle, and he saw himself as the person who was paying the workmen, organizing the workmen, and he said handing out bakshish for found objects. That was his role. Whereas he saw Albright as the scientific coordinator of the campaign. So Albright was the one who had the archaeological experience, the archaeological background. You see that Ovid Sellers was more of an Old Testament scholar as opposed to an archaeologist. You might also recognize some of the other archaeologists in the picture, Cyrus Gordon, Nelson Glick. I don't know if you've heard of William God and Labib Soriel. These are Egyptian archaeologists. They were actually cousins. They were trained in Egypt and served at many excavations at this time at different sites. They had a lot of archaeological experience. They were often doing the surveying, sometimes even directing the site when the directors weren't on location. So they had a lot of responsibility. I know less about Bulis al-Araj. He attended the Friends School in Ramallah, and somehow he got connected with Albright. So he first shows up at Beit Mirsin with Albright, and then Albright brought him to the project. But he's not given as much consideration as God and Soriel. God and Soriel had this training in Egypt under Fisher, whereas al-Araj did not have that training, and Sellers talks about that. He sort of differentiates al-Araj from Soriel and God. This is the staff photo in 1957. Obviously, huge gap in time between 1931 and 1957. A lot of things happened in that part of the world that prevented them from getting back to the site. Finally, in 1957, they had some money. Sellers happened to be in Jerusalem at the time on sabbatical, so they jumped at the opportunity to have another project. It was a short project, and they didn't actually stay at the site this time. They stayed at the Albright and just traveled every day to the site. The main director at this point of the project was H. Neil Richardson. You can see Sellers is looking a little older at this point. And again, you may recognize some of the other people who became more famous archaeologists. Robert Funk plays a big role in the archaeological report. He writes a big section of the final report. He was actually not an archaeologist himself. He was a expert in the studies of Jesus and also in Hellenistic Greek language. The Lapps, on the other hand, were archaeologists and ceramic specialists. And they write chapters on the ceramics. And you can see the difference in the text between Funk's he's much more into the literature, text of what's happening and tying it in with the archaeological record, whereas the Lapps are more writing about the ceramics, the stratigraphy, things like that. So here's the site itself. It is on an important roadway. Here's the map site, and here's in the foreground is the tent camp. And I have a picture, a close-up. Again, this is from the 1931 season because in 1957 they didn't stay at the site. As was pretty typical of excavations at the time, in 31, they were really reading the stratigraphy through the historic lens. So I haven't looked back at their stratigraphic notes and really redo their stratigraphy. My sense is there are actually fewer phases than what they have here, but they sort of understood a phase as if there's a wall, it must be associated with a war. If there's no wall, well, that's when there's a prosperous period, and you can kind of see that in their stratification, right? How they did it. In yellow are the periods when the bathtubs show up, the strata that the bathtubs are associated with. They make no discussion about what it means that bathtubs are in different strata. And again, I'm not sure that I believe it, but that I believe their stratification. There's nothing really in the ceramics or in the coins that helps differentiate from the different strata. So for the sake of this discussion and my current research, I'm just assuming that all the bathtubs are pretty much in the same strata, maybe slightly different phases. There is earlier material at Beth Zur, but the Hellenistic occupation really cut down to the bedrock. So they couldn't really make sense of any of the earlier material. They find a lot of, Iron Age sherds and things, but they don't really discuss it, and they can't really understand what was going on because of the Hellenistic occupation above it. So I said, really excited about the bathtubs. This room 27 is the biggest cluster of bathtubs. You can see here's one, here's two, here's three. And there's another one up on a wall somewhere. I think there's a better picture coming up. And they didn't know what to make of them, right? So 13 bathtubs of different sizes and shapes. And initially they said, in the first preliminary publication, Sellers and Albright write, prevailing opinion is that even though these things look like bathtubs, we think they're for some industrial purpose, such as dyeing, tanning, or fulling cloth, right? And they captioned this photo, "A dye plant of the Maccabean age." Now, Albright was already interested in dyeing because he came across at Beit Mirasim. He's excavating Beit Mirasim at the same time. And he'd come across basins that he had already suggested were for dyeing wool. So he's already got that in his head. So it's interesting that that's their first thoughts. Even though these things look like bathtubs, we think that they're for dyeing, tanning, or fulling cloth. But for some reason, you start to see this change. So 1931, Sellers and Albright, a dye plant of the Maccabean age. By the time Sellers wrote his final report by himself without Albright in 1933, we've now got an ore. Same picture from a different angle. Hellenistic bathroom ore dye plant. So he started to question it, right? He goes from very sure to maybe not. He says, at first we were inclined to take the structure as a bathroom, without question. It was next to the cistern, and it seemed quite logical, and they looked like bathtubs. And I said, we're lucky that Sellers writes about his thinking in his report. So this is one of the tubs. It's, let me see if I go back. Hold on. I said there was one up. So this one is up here. I don't know why it's up higher, but it's up higher in the room. So these captions where it says figure, these are the captions from the report, where this thing is identified as a foot bath. And they have a number of these foot baths. Sometimes today they're more likely called hip baths or sitz baths. And the idea was that somebody would sit here and their feet would be down here and water would collect down here after, I guess, it would be poured on them. So Sellers says, although we thought initially that these were baths, he says, from the first, however, Mukhtar Abd al-Qadir Yusuf, who was the owner of the site at the time, he was the village leader. The tell was owned by the entire village, but he was the one who was in charge of getting the labor for Sellers and Albright, and he was the one that Sellers and Albright talked the most with, had their dealings with, and he owned the site. So it's the Mukhtar who said, as soon as he saw these things, he said, you guys have a dye plant. That's where that idea initially comes from. It was from the Mukhtar who said it to Sellers. He said, this is a dye plant, especially for hides. He says, in these foot baths, the hide or the cloth could be soaked in the dye in the lower part of the basin and then placed on the ledge, right? And this depression in the corner would allow the fluid to be saved without waste. And then Sellers says, you know, this looks exactly like these other Hellenistic foot baths. He's like, I really am uncomfortable with this idea of this perfumed water, so I kind of like that idea of a dye bath instead. He said the position of some of these baths is, well, they're really crowded. It doesn't look like it would be comfortable for bathing. So he says industry actually seems to fit this better than bathing. Turns out they also found a ton of weaving equipment. So you've got these potential bobbins again, those sherds that Petrie said may have been used to wind on the yarn. You have pin beaters, which are for picking the weaving as you're going. Here are a lot more of these pin beaters. Here are loom weights. They had a ton of weaving equipment. He says the presence of many loom weights, spindle whorls at the top, needles of the Hellenistic period would indicate that we've got a textile industry at this site. But here's Sellers' problem. Again, he's laying this out for me. The majority of archaeologists who have visited the site or seen the pictures of room 27 prefer the bathroom explanation. All the basins are Hellenistic, and they bear a resemblance to some of the baths found in Greek excavations. Right? So that's his problem. All the archaeologists, the Americans, the Europeans that all show up at the site, all think that these are Hellenistic bathtubs. So by the time the 1957 excavation is published, which took another 10 years, through a whole bunch of different mishaps, the entire manuscript got lost at sea, so it took a while. They have a couple of preliminary reports that come out in the early 60s, and between the preliminary reports and the final reports, they are now adamant that these things are for bathing. The installation, which we provisionally called foot baths, with the reservation that they had been used for dyeing, now seem definitely to have been used for washing purposes, including face washing, sponge baths, maybe bathing children, and only occasionally for dyeing, for laundry and possibly dyeing. Paul and Nancy Lapp also, and this is really just supposed to be a chapter on ceramics, but they get into the debate as well. Everybody wants to really, pound it in that the weight of the new evidence, you kind of wonder, the new evidence, they only found 2 more in the 57 season, so where was their new evidence? The weight of the new evidence favors the bath theory over the dye vat theory, although the function of the multiple basins is still unexplained. They even demonstrate the use of these bathtubs. Well, he doesn't look very happy. And you read the caption as one of the Beth Zur foremen demonstrating the stepped bath. And that word demonstrating, right? Like, how much agency did he really have? Right? His boss told him to sit in this thing, right? So is he demonstrating it, right? Because he's like, oh, is he active in this, right? Not only that, but they also add in the caption, because you can't tell in the black and white image, someone has poured water over him.
Oh, that's even worse.
To demonstrate, right? I said they have to include it in the caption because you can't tell in the picture. To demonstrate how this thing would have worked, right? So they've poured water. He's now wet and sitting in this tub to demonstrate that this is really a bathtub. Now, one of the things that did change between 1931 and 1957 was the excavators' relationships with the villagers who were living at the site. In 1931, they described great relations with the natives, right, with the local villagers. Again, Abd al-Qadir Yusuf, he was the guy who mentioned to them in the first place that they had a fullery or a dye industry, helped them very materially and proved himself most satisfactory. And you can see I just included some of the different pictures of the villagers. There's also one of these sort of exotica photos, right, that they include in their report for no other reason than it was of interest in the 30s, right, to show these different ethnic types, right, that they had. A Muslim villager, a Christian Arab, and an Egyptian villager. What I find interesting as I try and also put face to some of these laborers is the text itself just talks about all the laborers having come from the local village. And this picture suggests that that's not quite true, that there were people who came from outside the local village as well. By 1957, things had changed. The tell itself was no longer just owned by the Mukhtar, but instead it was owned by individual farmers who had terraced the land, and you can see the different terracing, and they were farming the site. So now, Sellers and Richardson, instead of just having to deal with the Mukhtar, with one person, they had to deal with a number of individual landowners who told them yes or no whether you could excavate where you wanted, and they had to negotiate, and there was probably, some money that was also given to these guys for the rights to excavate on their property, right? So they didn't like that. Richardson and Sellers didn't like that. They found it much easier to just negotiate with the Mukhtar than with all these individual landowners. Interestingly, though, so it was actually very fertile fields. And Sellers and Richardson also take credit for the fertility of the fields. They say, well, we helped out because in 1931 we removed all the rocks and we turned over the soil, so really they owe us, right? Because their fields wouldn't have been as fertile if we hadn't have helped them out this way. They're also pissed because they hired one of the locals as a watchman, and while he was watching the site, this bathtub was vandalized. And I found it really interesting, too, that at the same time this goes into, there's this meeting in 1943 in Jerusalem of world cultural experts who are all talking about, whose responsibility is to preserve the archaeological material. This is material that belongs to the world, right? And the local populations, they're saying, really don't have the expertise or even the desire to preserve the material for themselves. Right, and we hear that all the time, right? We hear it a lot, that things belong better in American or European museums. They shouldn't be repatriated because the local populations can't take care of the material themselves. And so this fits their experience fits right into more general discussions that were happening at the time. So these bathtubs are now understood as part of this Hellenistic experience that's come to the Levant. So Hellenism, they say, brought all these luxuries. Hellenism brought bathing to the Middle East. And bathing is associated with leisure and luxury, something that the elites would partake of. And so these bathtubs, even though the bathtubs look a little different, some of them than the Hellenistic bathhouses, they said, oh, that's just a regional flavor, right? But they describe it as part of this Hellenistic culture that has come to the Middle East. So I just brought some reconstructions. But obviously, right, there's all this textile equipment as well. And I think, okay, so why is there such complications in figuring out if these things are for bathing or for textile processing? You would think that these things would be really quite different, but it turns out they have a lot in common, right? They both need access to water supply, a means to dispose of large amounts of water, whether you've just washed your wool in it or just washed bodies in it, a means of heating the water, right? And large tubs for either bathing people or bathing wool. So there's a lot of commonalities that these two activities would require. And actually, if you go back and look, I've found some bathhouses that are reused as textile processing sites. I found textile processing sites that are rebuilt as bathhouses. And I have found other places where people are unsure. Some people say this is a bathhouse, this is a textile processing site. And I think about this site. So this is the Phylonica of Stephanus at Pompeii, right? A reconstruction. Here's the plan, here's a reconstruction. We have textual records that tell us that this is a place for fulling wool, right? But what if we didn't? What if we just had the archaeological record? What if we just had the plan? Would we be able to differentiate between a bathhouse and a wool processing site? If we didn't have anything that said this was a wool processing site? And I don't think we would. I think we would see these large basins that were plastered and looked like they would be used for water and think bathhouse. So we're lucky here. And we have to think about, what about all those times we don't have the textual record letting us know what something is? So here's what a modern day tannery or wool processing site even, so it's used as both in Old City, Cairo, Egypt. Lots of these large basins. It looks kind of similar. They're doing lots of activities associated with, sometimes with leather, sometimes with wool. They're washing the wool, they're spinning it, they're dyeing it. All kinds of things are all happening at the same place. Plus, I said we've got also the ethnographic record in Turkey, which has these basins that kind of look like this, right? Where you could have the wool sitting here to drip dry. And actually, when you wash wool, wool has in it, so you've got the wool fibers, and then you've got lanolin, right? And you also have something called suet, which is like sheep sweat. Suet's what gives that smelly wool smell. Lanolin is not water soluble, so you need some kind of detergent to get rid of it. But suet is water soluble, and suet is mostly phosphate salts. And you could use it actually as a soap. So there are some people, there's something called fermented suet method of washing your wool, where you just take your wool, you put it in a bucket with water, you let it sit for weeks, and it self-washes itself. And then you can reuse the waters, sort of like a starter batch, like a yogurt or sourdough. You can reuse the waters again and again and again. So that could be why we've got receptacles to collect that water, right? That water is useful. So here's where I want you to rethink, right? If these aren't part of a luxurious lifestyle where one would go to the bathhouse, just the elite, right, and hang out and bathe and get scrubbed with a sturgill and all kinds of other things that the elite were doing at the bathhouses, and instead is some sort of industry, right? We got a lot of rethinking to do about what's going on in this part of the world in the Hellenistic period, right? If these are dirty, sweaty, smelly places of work. Now, I'm not saying all bathhouses were. I'm not saying that Roman bathhouses weren't these amazing places and that they don't continue to develop as public bathhouses. But I question some of these earlier ones, right? That may be more a form of industry or crafts than a luxurious lifestyle, right? And that's going to cause us to have to rethink a whole number of assumptions that we've had when we've come across these bathtubs, where maybe they're not something to do with ritual when we find them individually, but they are something that is secular. Some of the bathhouses you see divided between gender, with the women on one side and the men on the other. And if this is an industry, then that issue also sort of goes away unless, I don't know, the wool workers are divided by gender, which I haven't heard of. We can talk differently about the scale of complex as well when you have this, huge number of these things. Is it some sort of large industry? We know people are working wool. We have all the textile equipment, and we know they're wearing woolen clothes, right? So we know that this is happening. We also know that they're using wool to stuff mattresses and all kinds of other things they're using wool for. So I haven't gotten to that place yet where I've sort of, rewritten, but I do think that it's time that we start rethinking some of these ideas. One of the other things I've come across too is the individual bathtubs on rural estates. When you look at Ottoman and earlier period tax records, they talk about these rural estates. And on the rural estates, they tend to have olive processing, grapes, and textile processing. So next time you see a rural estate that has olive processing, a wine trading place, and a bathtub for bathing, I think we should think of this trifecta of olive, grapes, and textiles. And that's where I'm going to conclude. So, thank you. Can we take a vote? Sure. All those for bathhouses. All those for textile processing. I've done my job.
Well done. Thank you very much, Laura. It was a fascinating story. So, are you happy to take some questions?
I am.
Very good, thank you.
Felicity,
Ray.
I'm going first. You asked. I'm sorry, I'll let you take the questions. You said Ray, right? Ray.
Surely, because of the weights and all the material to do with dyeing in close proximity, in a number of the examples that you showed, surely that's no.
I said Carrie Orgus said that they were taking baths, and I haven't yet achieved the seniority where I was going to go up against Carrie Orgus. Ashkelon has a bathtub. They also have a ton of loom weights found in the same vicinity as the bathtub, and I was privy to some of the pictures of what the bathtub looked like when they actually found it. They found it, the Ashkelon one, they found it in secondary use as in some sort of installation, and they reconstructed that bathtub from the pieces in secondary use. No, I'm building my case.
Yes.
Surely a Hellenistic luxury elite bathhouse would only make sense if the site was home to a significant elite who could have afforded it. Now, I know nothing about the context of the site, but Is there anything in the archaeological record which suggests the presence of a Hellenized elite who might have even considered using a bath? I bet it isn't, because if you found an industrial context, that doesn't suggest that.
So there are a lot of bathtubs in Jerusalem, in elite homes. They're individual, they're not like this,
But
they're
then there could be
individual.
household production of some sort of textiles. I'm thinking,
Which I think they are, and not bathing, but they've always been associated with bathing.
I mean, on your site,
Right,
if
on my
somebody-
site.
If the excavators in the 30s and 50s were trying to rationalize what they found, shouldn't they have looked at the context on that site as to whether there was an elite present
Right.
who might have been even considered having such a bathhouse if there was a bathhouse built?
So they associate things like plastered walls and plastering with luxury, as opposed to waterproofing or other things of industry. So they do try and identify it. They also see the bathroom as the one, room 27, as being a place where soldiers could bathe because they have they're thinking that this is a citadel and there's Maccabean wars, and so they try and tie in a lot of things together that don't really logically work. But
even the Hellenistic and Roman baths I've seen where there were individual compartments rather than communal bathing, they look quite very different layout. It just doesn't fit.
so again, it fits their thinking about what's happening at this period, right? So following the Maccabean Wars, right, you have what they see as a debate in the literature with the those high in politics following more Greek style living, and that goes against what they saw as the Jewish practices. So there's tension in the text between how much the elite or how much the group is following Hellenism and giving up on some of these other things. So again, these guys many of them weren't archaeologists, they were text people, and this is the background that they're thinking about.
So we've got a number of questions.
I grew up with my mum every Monday morning and other mornings scrubbing at the sink on a washing board. So what I want to ask you is that there must be an awful lot of literature from the time, which mentions these things possibly incidentally. If this wasn't used for washing, ordinary washing of clothes, where did they wash their clothes? Do we know? And secondly, is there any literature in the time which mentions these rooms, and what happens in them, which might touch on this?
So part of I think part of the issue is that it seems that all the way into sort of Roman times that the person who fulled the clothes may also have been the person who washed clothing. So because it's the same process, once you know the chemical properties of wool, the physical properties, you can do both, right? So they're probably used for both washing laundry and creating new fabrics. Again, in the more recent ethnographic literature, I think of I can't think of his name at the moment, but he did a volume on rural Palestine, and in many of the homes, in the courtyard, there is a bathtub for laundry, right? So I thought that was really interesting to think about. Some of the bathtubs, in fact, the one at Mikne, the archaeological report talks about that it was full of pebbles, so that could have been the rough surface, but they assumed that the pebbles were post-dated the use of the bathtub, right? That the pebbles were what filled it in when it went out of use, so they just threw them out, as opposed to potentially it being part of the use of the thing. I'm hoping that the more I spread the word, the more bathtubs that are being found now, people will stop and maybe think to excavate them a little bit differently.
You haven't found any electric washing machines yet?
I haven't found any electric washing machines.
Very good. Yeah.
Hi. It's very interesting. I just got an additional question. When I mean, they would be using like urine for helping the, processing the wool, and that would smell. And we've had, will the industrial site be on the outskirts of the town? Because, like in London, all the smelly industry was to the east because of the prevailing wind came from west to east, and so the rich people, such as members of the PEF, could live in the west part of London, and not be worried by the extraneous smells. So it looks as though these bathtubs are in the middle of the conurbation, which
Right.
seems a bit odd.
So, and that question has been raised to me before, and I actually think that less than the urine smelling, it was the smell of the suet, of the wet wool, would have been really, really stinky. But I looked at sites like Pompeii, and the Fulleries are right in the middle of the city. And in Wilmington, North Carolina, there was a tannery right in the middle of the city. So I have to assume that sometimes they were in the middle of the city and stink didn't matter as much or wasn't as significant. So I can't rule it out. I said, when I got all this, I taught a class last semester for the first time. I volunteered because I taught this class on Pompeii because I really wanted a chance to look at the site where we've got such great textual information. And the Fulleries are right there in the middle of the city. So I can't exclude the fact that they may have also been in the middle of the city in earlier times as well. Yeah.
Jeff.
Surely, however clean you want people to be, you only need one. You don't need a whole row of bathtubs. I mean, it's obvious that the tubs are close together. This is because you're moving your textiles from one to another, to wash it or rinse it. I think that's it. It's pretty obvious to me.
Yeah, thanks. And there are different processes, right? There's washing the wool, there's scouring the wool, there's fulling, there's dyeing. They might all be in different. And then there's lanolin extraction. If you want to use the lanolin for cosmetics, which we know that they're doing, that's a totally different process, which is also going to require some sort of big deep basin.
In Morocco, in Fez, you have places where there are whole rows of these for dyeing, and they move the stuff from one to another.
Yeah, and I understand it really smells.
Yeah.
Felicity.
Well, that was going to be my question, was that they look like installations rather than, a nice bathroom somewhere. All those, together, you couldn't move people around in that way.
But, I think so too, but where I found this site of Beth Zur is a relatively recent text on bathhouses and Judea, Roman Judea and Syria.
So the other thing that I was going to ask is, does this have implications for other sites, perhaps not Hellenistic, but other sites like Qumran, where water installations have been very much interpreted in a particular kind of way to fit a particular narrative?
Well, the same in Jerusalem as well, Herodian sites and whatever, about purity and mikvahs and right. And I'm taking it one step at a time because
it's interesting.
I think it's interesting, but I think I will have a stronger argument if I take it slowly than say, I don't think these are really, all these bathtubs are really for ritual purity. I think they're for washing the wool. Something else.
So
Right?
let's have one more question, and then we'll have some refreshments,
Okay.
so we can
I'll give you
really
some more water.
pin you down.
What was the relationship between what you call the foot baths, quote unquote, and the bigger basins on the site? Were they associated? Were they in a separate part of the site? Or what?
So one of them was in that room 27 with these other basins. Others were in different places. I don't exactly remember where the one with the guy sitting in it is. That's one of the better ones preserved. And then there was the one that was destroyed through vandalism that also is very similar.
Because I've seen installations like that at Kerkouan in Tunisia,
Uh-huh.
but not the other basin type.
Right. So
and there they were labelled as bathrooms.
right, they're labeled as bathrooms, and they're very right. It's very common. So at Pompeii, there's one of the bathhouses in a back part of it has these step baths, these sitz baths or hip baths, whatever you want to call them. The interpretation is that might have been the earlier part of the bathhouse, which then developed into later, or is where you could get your clothes washed while you were in the bathhouse, because obviously you weren't wearing them. But it's something I'm still very much working on,
So watch this
because,
space.
right, watch this. I mean, yeah, and I don't, every time I'm a Bronze and Iron Age archaeologist, so every time I venture into the Hellenistic period or later and Hellenistic Tunisia and I really have a lot of learning to do in order to make my points more strongly, because I need to have the context. So, but I'm happy. I'm always looking for MA students. If anybody's knows an MA student who wants to work on this material, I've got lots of things.
I can't afford any more tuition fees.
Well, thank
Anyways.
you very much indeed. That was an excellent talk.
Thank you.